So I've been putting finishing touches on my own debut album recently, which has gotten me to go back and listen to a lot of debut albums from bands that I love. So I thought, why not make a list of my top 10 favourite debut albums? Turned out that there were so many incredible debut albums that I couldn't actually keep it to just 10, so I'm probably going to have to do multiple videos. But for the meantime, I'm just going to stick with the top 10. The only ground rule I have for this list is I'm not counting albums from musicians who only have one album, because that's a topic for a different list. But for now, here are my top 10 favourite debut albums. The first Foo Fighters album is notable for being a Dave Grohl solo project comprising of songs that he wrote before, during and shortly after his time as the drummer for Nirvana. It came out in a very awkward period in alternative rock where grunge music was starting to die off and people were starting to look for something different. Although the debut Foo's album has a very strong grunge sound, the songs are catchy enough and exciting enough not to falter under the overlooming shadow left by Nirvana. Dave's songwriting is very rough and raw. In many places the songs are underdeveloped, but that adds this intense layer of authenticity which helps stand this album out when looking at the band's discography as a whole. The punky grunge sound adds an extreme level of excitement on tracks like This Is a Cool and I'll Stick Around, while the clear power pop influence leads to some of the more catchy and subtler tracks like Big Me or Floaty. Although very clearly a product of its time, it's an album that is still just as fun and full of passion today as it was almost 25 years ago. An absolute pioneering album in female-fronted rock music, Liz Phair's Exile in Guyville is undoubtedly one of the most influential albums from the 1990s. Much of the album is very basic, following the basic guitar, bass, drums and vocals formula, but Phair's emotional honesty, crude humour and forward-thinking lyrical content helps it stand out even today as an incredibly important album. The album is a song-by-song response to the Rolling Stones' Exile on Main Street, which it responds to in a way that, although may not be completely obvious, does definitely match the tone of the music and lyrics in an almost satirical way. Phair's lyrics are perfectly contrasted by the gritty, textural yet basic lo-fi production. Musically, the album constantly switches around from the heavier indie rock sound of songs like 6-1 or Never Said to the almost folky sound of songs like Gunshy. The album is full of imagination, fascinating lyrical stories and an almost confident vulnerability which helps it to be as powerful now as it was back in 1993. In the large outpouring of British indie rock in the mid to late 2000s, the Wombats were a band who saw instant success and became one of the biggest bands in the scene without ever reaching the stadium level that bands like Arctic Monkeys or Kaiser Chiefs achieved. Their debut album showed them exploding onto the scene with huge sing-along anthems full of comedic lyrics, massive hooks and some of the most recognisable guitar riffs of the entire British indie rock scene. The album is full of high energy, twangy and bouncy songs that were instantly destined for small clubs and festivals around the country. The album has a youthful quality that added this large layer of charm, helping the album stand out above many other bands coming out of the scene. They mixed in the self-deprecating humour of Ben Folds, the jangly pop style of the Smiths, together with the cheesy harmonies of the Beach Boys, into a collection of fun, vibrant and incredibly bright rock songs. The album is very much a product of its time and maybe one that wouldn't quite work if it was released now, but I personally think this is the band at their absolute best. The album is self-aware, sharp-witted and incredibly fun. Easily one of the most underrated albums in the post-punk revival boom of the 2000s. Coldplay are considered a laughingstock in the music industry, but they have quite a few really great albums, especially their first four. Parachutes may not be as great as A Rush of Blood to the Head, but it's still an incredibly deep, beautiful and expansive slice of post-Britpop pop rock goodness. Despite taking almost too much influence from U2, Radiohead and Jeff Buckley, the band bring a lot to the table due to their elegant, emotionally genuine songwriting, pitch-perfect production, incredibly powerful vocals, and some of the best pop songs of the early 2000s. Although musically very similar to the band's contemporaries like Travis and Keane, this album stands above the rest of the post-Britpop crowd due to the band's atmospheric and moodily romantic tunes that remained among the best that they've ever done. Songs like Sparks, Spies, We Never Change and my personal favourite Coldplay song Shiver are all proof that the band shone to the scene, showing a massive amount of potential right from the get-go. This is an album that any time I throw on a song from it, I end up listening to the thing front to back and belt the words out at the top of my voice. Anyone that writes this band off because of their bigger songs should really listen to this album in full, because I think it's just an incredibly powerful and beautiful record. One of the earliest products of musical internet marketing, Arctic Monkeys exploded onto the scene in the early 2000s due to their tongue-in-cheek, fast-paced and snotty garage punk song satirising British youth. Their debut, Whatever People Say I Am, was an instant smash hit, and over a decade later it's not hard to see why. The album is a riveting dissection of youth culture covered in crunchy, raw guitar riffs, pounding drums and bouncy bass lines. The album follows the conceptual theme of British knife life, pointing a finger at the people in the scene in a way that to this day is still incredibly relatable. Anyone who has gone clubbing, seen the dregs of people out, got on a kebab and taken a taxi home will feel everything that Alex Turner sings on this album. Songs like I Bet That You Look Good on the Dance Floor and When the Sun Goes Down are massive post-punk revival jams that are relentless, catchy and instantly infectious. Although the band would get incredibly experimental following this album to mixed results, the simplicity, roughness and cheeky sound of their debut still helps it stand out as one of the best albums of the 2000s indie rock boom. While the Wombats were playing small clubs around the country, Bloc Party had taken the world by storm and were playing huge venues around the world off the back of their debut Silent Alarm. Silent Alarm is a visceral, expansive record full of energy, passion and existential lyrics that are cryptic and poetic yet incredibly clear. Frontman Kelly Okereke's lyrics are surreal yet confessional, taking clear influence from poets such as Sylvia Plath. Songs like Eating Glass are full of incredibly aggressive and violent imagery which parallels perfectly with the speed, aggression and vigour of the track, but at the same time he's not afraid to delve into the political state of the world at the time on tracks like The Pioneers and one of the band's biggest songs, Helicopter. Unlike many of the post-punk revival bands who stuck to one simple sound and ran with it, Bloc Party experiment with styles and sounds all over this album with clear influence from early U2, The Cure and even dance music. Songs like Helicopter, Banquet and She's Hearing Voices are straight up dance punk songs full of bouncy riffs, huge choruses, and some of the most exciting instrumentation from any bands of their time. But the band also slowed down on songs like Blue Light and This Modern Love, in which they show clear influence from slower songs from bands such as The Smiths. The band made a lot of great material following this album, but they never came even close to being quite as incredible as this one. They're currently doing a tour where they play the album in its entirety, and I highly recommend going to see them, because even with half the band being completely different now, they're just as incredible live as they are on the recording. Unknown Pleasures is one of the most influential albums of all time. When it comes to post-punk and gothic rock, this is the first album that I instantly think of. It's a constantly mysterious, gloomy album that may be incredibly depressing, is also romantic, full of energy and more soulful than any record coming out at the time. The songs on this album are some of the most visceral, emotional and hard-hitting songs ever written due to the revolutionary production techniques, the incredibly spacious and atmospheric guitar lines, the punchy and dirty bass lines and the broken, almost disturbing vocal delivery from Ian Curtis. Curtis's lyrics are like a doomy, cryptic series of images that are thrown together in a way where the pieces may not fit together perfectly, but somehow create something completely new and unique. And his vocal delivery is incredibly melodramatic and passionate. His vocals can definitely be compared to Jim Morrison's, however they are a lot more fragile, nervous and clumsy. The album is a cavernous experience that completely swallows you up into a feeling of despair and hopelessness. But at the same time, it's very much clear that this is a band to come out of the punk scene due to the very gritty, destructive and raw sound. Songs like Interzone and She's Lost Control could have easily been straight up punk rock songs due to their aggressive attitude and heavily distorted guitar lines. Although very different to the band's louder, more punk-leaning live shows, the album is beautifully produced and full of some of the most revolutionary production ever. Martin Hannett's production on the album is still some of the best production work to ever go into an album. It helps create one of the most atmospheric, darkly beautiful albums ever written. The band's follow-up wasn't quite as good, and the band New Order that they eventually turned into never quite managed to top the album, but they ended up doing quite a lot of really great stuff, which is just a true testament to how much of a masterpiece this album is if they never came close to it. Although many of the post-punk revival bands were more inspired by the sounds of garage rock and new wave, Interpol's sound is undeniably post-punk. The post-punk of Joy Division and Susie and the Banshees, that very reverb/delay heavy sound. Interpol don't come close to reinventing the wheel with their debut album, but they do incorporate many of the best elements of these bands and mix them in with a large helping of shoegaze textures. The album is a dark, luscious and melancholic slice of beauty which perfectly painted the unified yet gloomy state of post-9/11 New York City. The album is full of frustration and confusion performed with a spellbinding sense of urgency. It perfectly blends the gloominess of goth rock with the atmospheric synth-heavy sound of dream pop, dollops in a large serving of dance punk energy, and sprinkles the psychedelia of Manchester bands like the Stone Roses over the top. It may be understandable why people would criticise the band for wearing their influence so obviously on their sleeves, but Interpol uniquely blend all their influences together in a way that gives them their own distinct sound, helping them stand largely above many of the other early post-punk revival bands. Although a bit of a sleeper hit upon release, it's easily one of the most influential albums in 2000s indie rock, paving the way for bands such as The Killers, The XX and The Editors. I personally only discovered this album a little under 2 years ago, but it's become an instant favourite of mine, with Interpol quickly creeping their way into becoming one of my favourite bands. And man, they are one of the top 5 best live bands going today. Although they would go on to do some pretty damn good stuff afterwards, this album is just an unparalleled masterpiece that they will almost definitely never be able to top. Basically kick-starting the post-punk revival boom in the 2000s, The Strokes' debut is an instant garage rock classic full of charisma, sharp guitar lines and incredibly ragged production, injecting the rawness of the 70s CBGB punk rock sound with a large dose of pop melodies and throwing in a healthy dose of the Velvet Underground. Is This It is another album that wears its influence on its sleeve while also feeling fresh and full of an infectious energy. Julian Casablancas' vocals are weathered and covered in so much grit that it sounds like he was recorded through a guitar amplifier. The bass lines are bouncy and energetic all throughout the album, especially on the title track, which has possibly my favourite bass line in any song ever. The guitar riffs are incredibly spiky and interlock perfectly. The guitar interplay from Nick Valenci and Albert Hammond Jr. definitely are reminiscent of Television. They show clear influences from ska and reggae on songs like Last Night and through the staccato rhythm of Alone Together. The drum lines on the album are full of these incredibly rhythmic patterns that almost sound like an old drum machine because of how gritty the production is on them. Julian Casablancas' lyrics observe the life and relationship scene in New York City. He throws in a large amount of comic quips that constantly hit hard, especially on songs like Hard to Explain or the apathetic New York City Cops. This album is incredibly important, and without it, we wouldn't have many of the indie rock bands to come out of the last 20 years. Love them or hate them, but these guys are pretty damn influential. Weezer have had a very interesting career, creating some of the best and worst music of the last 25 years. Although I personally prefer Pinkerton, there is no denying that the Blue Album is an absolute masterpiece of alternative rock, power pop, and really just rock music in general. Taking the thrashy sound of hard rock bands from the 70s and 80s, mixing it in with the bubblegum power pop sound of bands like Cheap Trick, and then throwing in the dynamic sound of the Pixies, Weezer's debut blissfully glides through sounds while having its own distinct sound. The album is full of loud, heavily distorted guitars and smashing drum lines, which are contrasted by the incredibly bright and melodic chord progressions and vocals from frontman Rivers Cuomo. The songs are fast, incredibly catchy, and full of some of the most memorable hooks from any rock songs from the 90s. Songs like Buddy Holly and Say It Ain't So were instantly iconic radio hits that anyone who's grown up in the last 20 years will have heard. These songs would go on to define an entire era of music listeners due to their accessibility, energy, melodicism, and strong sense of humour. Rivers' lyrics on this album are just absolutely incredible because of how vulnerable, self-deprecating, and full of pop culture references they are. When I discovered this album, everything I listened to seemed to be about love and partying and stuff that, as a nerdy kid who kept to himself and just played guitar in his room a lot, I couldn't really relate to. But this album was kind of written for the outsiders, so it's one that I instantly connected to. It was written for that nerdy kid who didn't really have anything in music to relate to. Songs like In the Garage are all about being lonely yet finding comfort in those little nerdy things that you have surrounding you. And when I discovered this album, it meant the absolute world to me. Every single song on this album is just absolutely incredible. It's incredibly catchy, fun, upbeat. The instrumentation is fantastic. Rivers' lyrics are great, and his melodies and choruses are just so catchy. I honestly could talk about the Blue Album for hours. In fact, I may just do a video about it one day. Wink wink. Hi guys, thanks for watching my top 10 favourite debut albums video. I'm definitely going to be doing another one of these soon, because when I wrote down my favourite debut albums list, I ended up having about 40 different bands on there, and I wanted to talk about every single one of them. So hopefully I can do a follow-up video to this one soon. I do of course have a Blue Album review hopefully coming out very soon. I just need to get down and actually write it. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you next time.